Okay, welcome back everybody to session 12 of the People's Commission into the Housing Crisis. And in this session, which is called Further Recommendations for Government Action, we're having a slight deviation from the format and the focus of previous sessions, which have quite rightly focused on the lived experience of people experiencing the housing crisis. But we do note that the 1,500 plus submissions, as well as much of the evidence that we've heard before the People's Commission, have actually expressed a strong consensus on the need for reform to de-commodify housing. And so this session is going to hear from a selection of organisations who did make submissions on this issue as part of the public call out, and this gives us an opportunity to explore that further. So each of the three organisations and people, in the case of Saul Eslake, will have 5 minutes to share opening remarks, followed by some questions initially by Doug and myself, if there's time for that too. At the conclusion of the session, I'll try to summarise what we've heard and draw things to a close. So with that, we're going to hear first from Greg Jericho and perhaps Matt Grudnoff as well from the Australia Institute.
Hi, Nicole. Thank you. It's Greg Jericho, Chief Economist of the Australia Institute, and I'm joined by Matt Grudnoff, who's Senior Economist of the Australia Institute. So all economists today. Thank you very much to the Commission for inviting us to appear today to give evidence. Housing in Australia is clearly at a point of crisis that is the result of decades of policies designed to lift property values and to benefit those who own assets. In effect, housing policy has been designed to treat housing as an investment or a commodity designed to increase in value rather than about providing a safe and secure place to live. For the first time in the post-World War II era, a majority of Australians in their early 30s do not own a home, and this lack of home ownership flows through into later years. Whereas 75% of those born immediately after World War II owned a home in their early 40s, now it is just under 65% for those born in the late 1970s. This has major implications for Australia's retirement system, given the interaction of the age pension and superannuation were designed in and for a situation where over 80% of people own their own home outright by the time they retire. Currently, housing is more expensive than any time on record. The average property prices in March quarter of this year across Australia were equivalent to 16.6 years of the per capita household disposable income. That's a 38% rise over the past 10 years, and it's 80% higher than the 9.1 years equivalent that it cost at the turn of this century. Currently, with a cash rate of 4.35%, which is, while high in recent years, remains actually historically low, we see that 9.2% of all household disposable income is being spent on property interest repayments. This compares with the 9.4% that was being devoted to property interest repayments just before the 1990s recession, when interest rates were at 17%. This is not something that occurred by accident or naturally. Housing policy has designed it to occur. The changing of the capital gains tax in 1999 to effectively provide 50% of capital gains tax-free, combined with negative gearing to turn the housing market effectively into a casino, but one where the operators were ensuring the odds were actually in the favour of the richest gamblers. Prior to these changes, the proportion of positively and negative geared properties was relatively equal. Afterwards, negative gearing numbers took off and have only come down recently due to near zero official interest rates that effectively made net gearing difficult. A similar occurrence occurs for the proportion and amount of capital gains, and the results have been clear. In the 30 years from 1970 to 2000, house prices rose just 1.2 times the level of per capita household disposable income. In the 24 years since, they have risen 2.2 times. And while property prices have risen across the advanced world, Australia remains affected more than others. According to the IMF and the Bank for International Settlements, since 2007, property prices in advanced economies have risen on average 63%, while here in Australia, they've risen 106%. Combined with these tax incentives is the long-term exiting of the public sector from the housing market. In the 1950s and 60s, around 15% of new residential construction was by the public sector. Since 2003, so essentially 20 years, aside from the period during the GFC stimulus, it has been below 2%. So 2 decades of taxation and government policy incentivising demand and reducing public supply have had the desired effect: higher house prices and less affordability. And both Matt and I welcome the opportunity to discuss our research with the Commission. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Greg. And now we'll hear from Emma Dawson from Per Capita.
Thank you, Professor Curran. I would back in most of what Greg said then from the Australia Institute. I'd like to emphasise, though, that our national debate about declining affordability of homes too often focuses on first home buyers at the exclusion of the larger issue of a lack of housing security across the life course and throughout all segments of the Australian populace. For example, it's not widely understood that on average across their lifetime, renters spend a larger proportion of their income on housing than do homeowners, although that's becoming more clearly evident in recent developments. Recent public debate also tends to position home ownership primarily as a generational divide, and while there are certainly significant issues in terms of generational equity and social mobility, this debate that often positions baby boomers as cashed up homeowners with multiple investment properties who are locking younger generations out, actually the evidence shows that around 1 in 4 older Australians lives in permanent income poverty, and this is primarily due to the fact that they do not own their home and they have to pay private rental costs on fixed retirement incomes. What is true, as Mr. Jericho said, and it should be of utmost concern to anyone leading our country, to policymakers and to people that claim to have our national interest at heart, is that the proportion of Australians who will never own a home is increasing, and this has dire consequences for Australia's future prosperity and social cohesion. It is primarily because younger generations are entering home ownership later than ever, if at all, and the long-term impact of this trend is already apparent. The proportion of homeowners aged 55 to 64 who are still owe money on their mortgage has tripled from 14% to 47% over the last 25 years. In a recent poll, 2/3 of Australians said that they thought home ownership would be out of reach for young people. This has significant consequences for intergenerational inequity, for social mobility, for family formation and for social cohesion. Government policy decisions to tax wages from working people more heavily than unearned incomes from rising property prices and concessions granted to existing property owners have, over the last quarter century, fueled an exceptional and damaging explosion in property prices. Australia is not unique in this regard, but arguably our problems here are more acute than they are in comparable markets. And at the same time, policymakers that made decisions, as Mr. Jericho said, probably most consequentially to introduce capital gains tax discount, which led to an explosion in land prices compared to wages. At the same time as these policies were implemented to reward those who already had a home, they failed to implement alternative housing models that could provide to private ownership, that could provide security for tenants. So housing security shouldn't have to rest on home ownership. We, in previous generations, had secure, publicly provided housing that was available to families from low and middle incomes throughout their lives. And both housing security should be seen as a goal and end in and of itself. We now have an acute rental crisis in Australia, and while there are various measures that can be taken to address high rental prices at state level, the best form of rent control is an increase in non-market housing. We see a significant shortfall of public and community housing, of social housing across our country, and the proportion of people who live in secure social housing has fallen by more than three quarters over the last 30 years. It is now seen as a safety net rather than a reasonable alternative to the market. This is the biggest failure of governments over recent decades. However, current prejudices in government policy are hampering efforts to reverse a very damaging trajectory that now sees more money going to those who earn in the highest incomes in our population to offset their investments in residential property for personal wealth growing purposes than we do going to those in the lowest income quintiles who should be provided with secure non-market housing. These problems are wicked, they are intertwined, there are many causes of our housing crisis, but we cannot look only at supply. We must look at the factors that drive demand, that push up prices, and that have seen essentially Australia's housing market become a financialised sector for the pursuit of wealth, rather than a sector that would provide, or a system that would provide everyone with a secure, safe, comfortable and affordable home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. And lastly, if we can turn to Saul Eslake.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all. I, perhaps reflecting the colour of my hair, feel like I've been saying the same things about housing policy for, in some cases, more than 40 years. That's particularly as regards first homeowner grants, or for 37 years when it comes to negative gearing, or for 25 years when it comes to the capital gains tax discount. And that's why the submission that I made to you essentially comprises two things that I wrote 8 and 11 years ago, along with a shorter summary of how I'm interpreting more recent developments. So I don't think it's a good use of my time or yours for me to recapitulate what I've written and said over a very long period of time, although I think perhaps I can usefully indicate that there's nothing that the people who've spoken before me have said here today that I would disagree with. You know, we're essentially on the same page regarding all of that. What I find striking is that I can't think of another area of public policy making where governments of both political persuasions have done the same thing for so long in the face of such incontrovertible evidence that what they do doesn't work. And yet, despite that, they keep doing, in most cases, more of the same thing, which kind of reminds you of Albert Einstein's definition of insanity, is doing the same thing over and over again and just hoping that the next time you do it, the result will be somewhat different when it hasn't been. And I list in one of the submissions I gave to you 16 things that governments could do to improve, I won't say solve completely, but improve Australia's housing crisis. They involve a combination of measures on the demand side and the supply side. And one of the unfortunate things about the way housing policy is debated in Australia is that we seem to be divided between those who think that all the solutions lie on the supply side, doing more of some things, whether it's governments doing more directly themselves to build housing, or stopping doing things that inhibit the private sector's capacity to provide housing. That's one camp. And on the other camp, you have people who think that all the government needs to do is to stop artificially inflating demand and all the housing problems will be solved. We need to do lots of things on both sides of the market, in my view. And in the face, as I say, of such incontrovertible evidence that what governments have been doing doesn't work, why do they persist in doing it? I find it difficult to avoid the conclusion that for all the crocodile tears that politicians of all persuasions shed for the difficulties faced by aspiring home buyers in particular, and to a lesser extent for those struggling in the rental market, our politicians actually know deep down that the majority of Australians don't want the problem to be solved. That is, in any given year, there are about 100,000 people who succeed in becoming first home buyers on average. And let's assume as I think is reasonable, that for each one who does succeed in that aspiration, there are 4 or 5 who fail, even though they'd like to. That represents maybe 400 or 500,000 votes for policies that would slow or halt the rate of property price inflation. Whereas politicians also know that at any point in time, there are at least 11 million people who own one property, their own, and there are in excess of 2 million people who own one or more investment properties. And the last thing most of those 11 million or more voters want, with perhaps a few altruistic exceptions, is anything that might slow the rate at which property prices go up relative to income. So on the one hand, 400,000 or 500,000 votes for policies that would slow the rate of house price inflation, potentially 11 million votes for policies that would maintain the rate of house price inflation. Even the dumbest of our politicians can, as the Americans say, do that math. And at the risk of sounding cynical, although in more than 4 decades of trying to understand and interpret and predict what politicians will do, no disrespect, Doug, I've never found that cynicism has led me to make erroneous conclusions. I think that that's what politicians of all stripes quietly do when they contemplate what, if any, changes should be made to housing policy settings. And how you get around that, I really don't know. If I did, maybe I'd have chosen to be a politician myself, but I've never taken that step. So that's probably as much as I should say.
What a very depressing note. But it's okay, because we're going to ask Doug to dig into those submissions, and you can kick off with the questions, Doug. But unmute yourself first. No, you're still muted.
Right,
Go.
can you hear me? Yep, sorry about that. Well, as a former politician, I must say I agree with Saul's analysis, but that won't help ameliorate the problems, never mind solve it. I have been lectured many times over the years that when there is market failure, government should intervene, and it should only be where there is market failure that government should intervene. I take the view there is clear market failure in the housing market, and I'm just wondering from an economic perspective, other than what Saul's already said, why don't those politicians who have lectured me over the years about only market failure demands intervention, why do you think that they won't, deal with the issues that they understand are the problems, and that is a market failure? So I'm happy for anyone to deal with that.
I'd like to respond, if I may, and also to Saul's comment, because I think it's relevant. Mr. Cameron, I think that the John Howard adage that no one had ever stopped him in the street and complained about the value of their property going up is the primary reason that politicians are unwilling to intervene in what is clearly a market failure, and what has throughout history been a failure of market to provide housing. Housing was not secure for people until governments intervened to create social housing. But I would like to inject a note of optimism into that discussion, because Centre for Equitable Housing conducted a national survey, including housing investors, just over a year ago. And it was the largest representative poll on this issue that has been done in this country for over 15 years. And we found actually that a bare majority of smaller housing investors, of smaller property investors, and bear in mind that 72% of those who own investment properties only own one, and another 13% only own 2. So only about 15% of investors own multiple properties. We found a majority of investors who were small or considered mum and dad investors effectively were mums and dads before they were investors, and were now so concerned about the prospects of their children owning a home that they were willing to countenance the value of their investment properties declining. There were 52%, so a bare majority, but that was of investors. Now, a great deal more of homeowners, non-investors but owner-occupiers, were willing to see the value of their property fall slightly if it meant their children could have access to secure housing. So I think the public mood and the public shift is ahead of our political leaders on this, and that a politician who was willing to say we are going to act in the interests of future generations would find themselves with more support than they think they have.
Okay.
You might be right.
Oh,
You might be right, Emma, about that. And I suspect that one of the reasons why opinion might be shifting, it could be that 50, 60 and 70-year-old parents are getting frustrated that their 20 and 30-year-old children are still living at home and expecting their meals cooked and their laundry done, and a blind eye turned to whoever they bring to the breakfast table the following morning. Others are probably worried that their children are going to pressure them into handing over their inheritance before nature decides that it should be handed over, and or are concerned that because they're not as rich as some other people's parents that their kids are going to miss out. And so I think opinion is changing that, and I think it's possible to interpret the results of the 2016 and 2019 elections as consistent with that hypothesis. So, yeah, I mean, I was being cynical for the sake of making the point. But to go to the question which Doug asks, I think the answer to it, Doug, is that there are a lot of politicians who, reflecting the will of a majority of their constituents, don't believe that the market has failed. You know, in other words, they believe the purpose of the housing market is to allow property owners to get richer, and it's doing that. So they would say, from the perspective that matters most to them, there is no market failure that demands government intervention. Or alternatively, they might say, in defence of negative gearing, and lots of people do this, that if you got rid of negative gearing, then landlords would sell their properties and the supply of rental housing would therefore fall and rents would, quote, go through the roof, unquote. What they conveniently and maybe deliberately forget is, of course, that the demand for housing, rental housing, would drop by an equal and opposite amount, so that there is no impact that need be felt on rents at all, and that the arguments so often put by property interests that negative gearing is essential in order to ensure an adequate supply of rental housing is a classic example of what used to be called Say's law, that is about supply creating its own demand. That negative gearing creates as much demand for rental housing by outcompeting prospective home buyers as it does create any supply of it, with the possible exception of tax preferential treatment for the construction of new housing for rent.
Okay.
Doug, if I could just add in a few points there. I'd certainly agree with what Emma has noted. I think that incredible line by John Howard was perfectly correct politically at the time he said it, which was, from memory, about 2002, 2003, at a point when the greatest cohort of voters would very much be in agreement with that. But as we know, as you get a greater share of people in their 30s and 40s who are not able to come up to John Howard and complain and celebrate their house price going up, that becomes less politically potent. I think the polls that Emma has pointed to reflect that. Actually, I think there is an opportunity for politicians to kind of be the first mover advantage of capturing these voters. I'd also just take a little bit of issue with the free market or free market failure. I think one of the problems with our housing market is the distortions by the public sector. As I point out, the capital gains discount, negative gearing, even first home buyer grants, the choices to basically reduce public housing. These are actually, in a sense, distortions introduced by the public sector. But so I'm not that I'm arguing for a free market. I certainly agree with them and there that a free market would not deliver anything good. But I'd say one of the problems is the interventions on the public side are actually, in some ways, making it worse. I think is probably a good way to do it, but certainly not helping.
Yeah. Well, look, they're all interesting points. What I'd like to ask now is, when I was Shadow Minister for Housing, I met with the superannuation funds. And we can have an argument about whether there should be more investment by governments in public housing. I support that. But we have community housing as well, and there's investment going in there. But the overall problem that I've been drawing my attention to is that we invest so much in housing that it deflects from being able to invest in productive industries in other areas. So there's a crowding out of investment in productive, say, manufacturing or other investments. Has anyone got a view on that?
Absolutely, Doug. When then Treasurer Peter Costello stood up in 1999 and announced the capital gains tax discount, he didn't mention housing. He talked about the fact that it would incentivise investment in the productive capacity of the economy. It has done the opposite, as you point out. We now have the most overinflated housing market in the world. And actually, while I can see it's attractive to young people that are very angry about this situation to blame landlords, individual landlords have acted entirely rationally based on the policies that were put before them. We created a market in which you could not only take on debt to buy an investment property and minimise your taxes while you pay off that debt, but realise a heavily discounted capital gain within 7 to 10 years at the end of it. If you had any extra cash or any extra equity over the last 25 years in this country, you were virtually forced to invest that money into the housing market. And that has had a direct impact, not just on the fortunes of first home buyers, but it has actually contributed to the uncertainty, the lack of tenure, the insecurity of rental housing, because what we have is 72% of landlords in this country are taking on debt to buy one investment property. They are highly leveraged. They cannot afford to maintain that property. They don't want to give a long-term lease because they're always looking at the moment which is best to realise that capital gain, which you can do after holding the property for just 12 months. And so they're not incentivised to provide good, high-quality, long-term security to tenants. So the interaction of those two taxes have not only created an insecure rental market and a high housing cost market, but they have taken what could have been trillions of dollars that could have been invested into new technologies, new industries, driving our move away from a carbon industry and startup businesses in this country. We have the least diverse economic and industrial base in the developed world, and that is partly because we have encouraged households to park their money in non-productive land. So I think that if you look back at the rationalisation that was made for the CGT discount in 1999, all we can say is that it was utter nonsense, and we have seen exactly the opposite outcome.
Okay. Any different views, or everyone agree with that?
I think Saul, you're on. Saul, you're on mute.
The CGT discount was originally introduced by Howard and Costello in 1999 as a recommendation of the Ralph Review of Business Taxation. And you might wonder from this distance why the Ralph Review would have made that recommendation, since it was about personal tax rather than business tax. But the reason Ralph gave was that it would turn Australia into a nation of shareholders and entrepreneurs. That was the language of the report. What it's done, of course, is, as Emma said, turned us into a nation of property speculators, because as it's turned out, the change to the CGT regime was much more generous to property investors than it has turned out to be to investors in the share market. And in fact, the proportion of adults who own shares directly, that is, other than through superannuation funds, has actually declined. And the proportion of the population, the working age population who are owner-managers of businesses, has also declined. Yeah, Doug, you will recall, because I think you were there at the time, that it was meant to be a quid pro quo for the change to the CGT regime that trusts would be taxed as companies, and the coalition then welched on that particular deal after the first half of it had been legislated. The other comment I'd make to follow on from something that Emma said is that Australia is very much an outlier in that the overwhelming majority of the rental housing stock is owned by individuals. In every other developed economy that I've ever looked at, with the exception of New Zealand, the rental housing stock is overwhelmingly owned by some combination of government authorities, not-for-profits, and companies specifically established for the purpose of building and managing rental housing. That's particularly true in the US and Canada. And all three of those are motivated, to the extent that they're motivated by any commercial consideration, by rental income, not by capital gains, because they are inherently long-term holders of the rental housing assets rather than traders in them. And one of the reasons why tenants have so few rights here compared with other countries is because landlords vote. You know, they're individuals, they're on the electoral roll. Whereas in most other industrialized countries, landlords are not on the electoral roll. They're governments, they're not-for-profits, or they're companies. And so, you know, the perverse incentives created by negative gearing interacting with the CGT discount have also had a profound impact on the way landlord-tenant relationships are reflected in the law. I'm not sure whether, and this is the third point I wanted to make, Doug, you were asking why superannuation funds don't invest in rental housing, which is a question that's often come up. And the answer, having kind of engaged in some of those conversations myself over the years, is that the returns to investment in rental housing are pre-tax broadly commensurate over time with those on government bonds, but in between, holders of rental housing have to pay things like council rates and land tax. And in particular, the way state governments levy land tax, not at progressive rates on total holdings, but at progressive rates on each holding of land that an owner might own. The after-tax return to investment in rental property is significantly lower than the after-tax return to bonds in most cases, with much greater risk. And so no rational superannuation fund acting in the interests of its members, as they're required by law to do, would invest in rental housing in those circumstances. That is, unless, of course, governments offer them a very big subsidy to offset the impact on their returns of things like land tax and council rates.
Sure. I had those discussions with the super funds, and I was really disappointed. Their argument was they needed scale, they needed higher returns, and the sole purpose test was a problem for them to deal with it. But given there is so much money going into superannuation, and none of it in relative terms is being used to assist dealing with housing, isn't that a flaw? I'll take that as yes.
As Karen might step in here. Look, we haven't directed any questions specifically to Greg or to Matt yet, and I'm quite keen, given the length of the submissions that the three organisations who are here have been, I'm quite keen to actually headline some of the solutions that that you've made, because we could sit here diagnosing the problem for the rest of the afternoon, but that is also in your detailed submission. So I wonder, and Doug, jump back in with your line of questioning, but while you're ready to jump, can I just ask Greg and Matt, what are your absolute, no-brainer solutions either to the immediate crisis and, systemically?
Yeah, look, I mean, if you want to make housing more affordable, as far as economists are concerned, there's two things you can do. You can increase the supply of housing, or you can decrease the demand for housing. If we want to decrease the demand for housing, let's decrease the investment demand for housing. Let's get rid of the capital gains tax discount, and you can get rid of negative gearing too if you want. But I think that if you got rid of the capital gains tax discount, you'll get rid of the problem. That would also raise about $20 billion. You could then use that $20 billion and the government could build a lot of houses. So not only are you decreasing the demand, the investor demand for housing and making it more affordable on that side, you would also be increasing the supply of housing, in particular the government building a whole lot of public housing, and that would also make housing more affordable. That seems to me the no-brain, lowest of low-hanging fruit that would be essentially budget neutral. In fact, you probably wouldn't even need to spend all 20 billion on housing. You could use it to fund other things if you wanted to, if the government wanted to.
So your 20 billion estimate, is that an annual estimate of the...
That's from the tax expenditure statement from the Treasury for, I think, this year or last year.
For residential property related tax concession?
Capital gains discount, yeah. I mean, it probably wouldn't be 20 billion in total if we removed it, but even still, the actual cost of the budget, even of building new homes, given it'd probably be off budget anyway, is not such of an issue. And our line of argument has always been that, and in a sense, it's actually reinforced by the fact we are having even this commission at all, is that housing is a pretty good bet for everyone in Australia. That nothing we're advocating would see a housing market crash. We'd still see a very stable housing market. Before the capital gains discount was introduced, there were good returns on housing. Housing was always seen as a good investment. We think the government should be investing in housing. It seems to be a smart thing to do. The government doesn't have to chase high risk returns. It should be able to go after solid returns that are also producing good social benefits, and that is actually places to live for people who need them. It seems we have been rather skeptical of belief that you need to set up a fund or things like this. Governments are able to borrow money at pretty decent rates, build houses, to either rent them or to sell them to people. There are schemes in which they could operate it under, such as enlarging the Defence Force housing scheme and broadening that for other public servants, other in-state public service as well. We feel that these are things that are not beyond our ken. It's I think a little bit, as Saul sort of pointed out, it's a lack of willingness on behalf of governments, perhaps because they currently believe that there are more votes in doing nothing and allowing housing affordability to get worse, but in a sense reducing the distortions on the demand side and in a sense returning to how it was in the 50s and 60s when Australians were public housing was around 12 to 15% of new builds. That with that to be able to go from being 1 in 10 or 2 in 10 rather than 2 in 100, I think would make a significant difference. And it's something that I think is open to the government. And one other point I'd like to return to, and this was something Doug said about crowding out. One of the things we have been investigating is actually the crowding out of the housing market by other sectors, especially the fossil fuel sector. And it's one reason why we've certainly been arguing the government should be very strongly not approving new coal or gas mines, is because they take away construction workers who could be used to build new houses. We often hear the talks about skill shortages. Well, if you're approving fossil fuel mines and construction of gas pipelines and so on, that not only are not good for the climate, they're actually exacerbating the skill shortage in housing, which we think is a crisis. And we also think climate change is a crisis. So we would certainly not be approving fossil fuel mines that are actually in effect, an indirect detriment to improving housing as well.
Thank you. Doug, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. There was two areas that I want to raise. One is the issue of the argument on rent control. And I think Emma spoke earlier about the actual market is working as the market, is supposed to work. It's governments who are, distorting the market. So if anyone wants to, add to that submission, that would be handy. What is the role of rent controls? And the other one that's just been raised is this issue of productivity. I've got a bee in my bonnet about the Farmer Review in the UK, where they discovered that the UK needed to move to new forms of house building that are more productive. They argue they're still building the same way they did 100 years ago. And what's the role for modular housing in increasing productivity, reducing costs, and being more environmentally sustainable? Is there anyone want to comment on any of those issues?
Well, can we have Emma on rent control, and then we'll go to Saul on efficiency in the industry?
Great, thank you. I'll try and be quick. We've looked in depth at what works to stabilise rents in the housing market through the Centre for Equitable Housing, and it's certainly true that while if we have a purely free market, then those interventions, and as my colleagues have pointed out today, the government intervenes in the housing market all the time, could have adverse consequences. But, and this is a big but, first thing to say is the most effective form of rent control is social housing, is non-market housing, is having a non-profit, publicly provided option for people, particularly on low and middle incomes, to have a secure home that is below market rates. That keeps downward pressure on private rents throughout the private market. It is by far the most effective thing governments can do. Beyond that, at the state level, we do see rent stabilisation measures that work quite effectively in the ACT. The ACT, it is important to note, has an unusual housing market. It is a high yield rental market. It is a high income part of the country, and it is also unique in that it's a territory and not a state. So the government there has both the responsibilities of local and state government. It would be more difficult to implement the ACT model in other states, particularly because we don't have the data they rely on to manage the moderation of rent price increases. However, the idea that rent control in and of itself is a negative is wrong. Rent freezes, simply freezing market rents across the board, has been shown to be detrimental to very low income renters, because what it does is force private landlords to think, well, I can't raise the rent, so I'll put it up before the rent comes in, or I will start to invest in higher end housing. So it can actually backfire on low income renters. But rent stabilisation measures, there are different generations of rent control. A rent freeze is considered first generation. Second and third generation rent stabilisation measures that seek to smooth out those peaks, those high spikes in asking rents between tenancies, can absolutely be mitigated through government measures. And some of these things are starting to be looked at by state governments. But simply freezing or controlling rents is a blunt measure that would be introduced to a market that, as we've canvassed here today, many of the factors that cause high rental prices, high levels of insecurity and instability in the rental market, go to the underlying structure of our market, and that's what needs to be addressed over time. If we are to hope for As Saul said earlier, other than probably New Zealand, if we are to hope for the kinds of secure long tenancies, predictable rents, rents that are in line with a proportion of income and don't become to the point where a significant number of people are living in rental stress, then we need large-scale institutional investors and government providers of housing. That is the only way to which to get there. And I would just like to put on the record that we have seen significant investment in housing at state and federal levels over the last 2 years. It's a huge improvement on what we've had over the last 25 years, but it's a drop in the bucket, a drop in the ocean of what has been a crisis that has been building for more than 30 years. And while that crisis is now affecting very educated, well remunerated young professionals in their 30s, this crisis has existed for low-income families, particularly single parents, older single women, people fleeing from domestic and family violence, recent migrants, refugees, and those from intergenerational low socioeconomic backgrounds for well over 30 years. And so this is a long-standing problem, and it will not be fixed overnight, but we do have an opportunity now, I think, with a growing public acceptance that we need to act, and with some measures being put in place at various state and federal levels to build on that momentum and to undertake serious reform on the demand side of the economy as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Saul, do you want to respond to
Yeah.
Doug's question about efficiency in the building sector?
Yeah, first, let me say I agree with everything Emma said about rent control there. We not necessarily coming to every problem from the same perspective, but I think she's absolutely right in what she said about rent control there. The second thing I'd say, just before going specifically to Doug's question, is that I think it's important not to be too nostalgic about the era in which governments directly built 1 in every 5 houses that were completed, which was in the Menzies era, ironically, although Menzies was implementing policies that were largely drawn up by his Labor predecessors. But it's also important to remember that that housing was typically badly built, poorly located from the standpoint of access to employment, services, and entertainment, and was designed primarily for people whose, quote, problem, unquote, was low incomes. Whereas, social and public housing today, their clients are overwhelmingly people with complex, multiple problems, whether it's single parents rather than traditional families, as they mostly were in the 50s and 60s, or, as Emma listed, people fleeing domestic violence or family breakdown, or with a whole array of other problems, people coming out of incarceration and so forth. And I would say government bureaucracies are poorly positioned to cope with those, to manage those. And that while I absolutely agree with what other people here have said about the need for increased public investment in housing, I draw a distinction between public investment in housing and public provision of housing, and that I think in general, the objectives of ensuring adequate, decent housing at affordable cost for people in a variety of needs is probably better accomplished in partnership with social housing providers and the like than being done through traditional housing commissions or departments. Going specifically to Doug's point, I think broadly he's right, and I draw in particular a contrast that I probably wouldn't in other aspects of the housing issue, but in terms of the construction of housing with the United States, where the cost of building housing, in a geography that's very similar to Australia's in lots of ways, is significantly lower than it is in Australia. And that is because most American housing is built as modular housing. That is to say, the materials are manufactured off-site and the housing is erected on-site. So not as many houses are built out of brick as is the custom in Australia, but a lot of them, whether they're wood or other building products, are typically manufactured somewhere else, transported to where they're going to be built, and then built in situ. And Americans are willing to tolerate much more homogeneous looking housing than Australians are. And while there are downsides to that, I mean, you know, the song about little boxes on the hillside, etc., you know, has some truth in it. It has resulted in cheaper housing for a lot of Americans. And it is probably something that we need to consider, especially if we want to build a lot of homes very quickly, which I think we do need to do in order to meet those circumstances. Part of the problem in doing that, of course, is that housing construction is dominated by small business. You know, although there are large developers like Satterley and you know, other builders like that, who operate across multiple dimensions. Most of the houses that are built in the private sector are built by, quote, small businesses, and small businesses are sacred cows. You know, one of the types of fetishism that exists in Australia, there's manufacturing fetishism, which we can, you know, the belief that there's something more important about manufacturing than other kinds of economic activity, and that manufacturing.
Well, there always was, Saul.
Well, yeah, of course there is. There is, but the difference in Australia, Doug, is that unlike most other Western countries, manufacturing in Australia is a low labour productivity form of economic activity. You know, in most other countries, manufacturing productivity is above average. Whereas in Australia it's not, and there are reasons for that that are not germane to this discussion. But we also suffer from small business fetishism. That is the idea that there's something inherently more noble about running a small business than working for a big one or for a government or a not-for-profit, and therefore people operating small businesses should pay less tax, which of course they often choose to do whether it's legal or not. So wanting to get the kind of scale economies that you see in America in particular in the construction of housing, and this spills over into Canada too for similar reasons, is that it would be seen as a challenge to small business, and their position is sacred to politicians of all political stripes. And I'm not sure how you get around that.
Look, it's been a fascinating conversation. I'm very mindful of the time. Is there anything else that anyone would like to add now, recognising, you know, that we're very grateful for your detailed submissions, and also if there was something that occurred to you after this hearing, you know, we'd certainly be very receptive to receiving it.
Just, Professor, I think that it is essential for government to look at property investment tax concessions. But I don't expect them to do that in isolation. I think it needs to be part of a consideration of a broader tax and transfer review, because as we've seen in the past, even with the introduction of the CGT, without addressing other underlying causes, for example, following through on the agreement to tax family trusts as businesses, there will be unforeseen and unexpected outcomes. I think that a review of our taxation system needs to begin from the basis of providing opportunity to people to build a good life, of taxing rents and non-renewable resources, of which land is one, more than we currently do, and relying on taxing income from people's labour less. That is how you allow young people to build a good life through their own effort, regardless of the position they're born into society. And so what I would like to see with the consideration of those tax concessions is that it is done through that lens. That may then mean that we don't entirely end up abolishing capital gains tax discount or negative gearing, but that we restructure them, for example, to incentivise investors to provide new housing or better located housing, or housing that is constructed along universal design principles so that people can age in place. I am relatively agnostic on whether we abolish or reform, but I think it is absolutely undeniable that the tax concessions as they currently operate in partnership with other elements of our tax and transfer system are robbing people of the chance to build their own good life through their own efforts. And so it's imperative that whomever wins the next federal election is willing to undertake that essential work on behalf of the Australian people.
Right, thank you. What I'm going to do is try and, in about 1 minute and hopefully less, just summarise some of what we've heard this afternoon. Look, starting with the expert diagnosis from the Australia Institute of the causes, which, you know, as you put it, I think were actually the tax incentives for investment in property and the withdrawal of the public sector from the housing assistance space. And then Emma reminding us that we should be focusing not so much on the barriers to home ownership that emerged as a result of that prioritisation of property investment rather than home ownership, but really we should be looking at housing security across the life course. And I think characterising Australia's housing problem as an unfair, access to housing security across the life course, which has occurred due to the lack of viable alternatives in Australia to home ownership. And then, dramatically truncating a very rich discussion, Saul's point that governments actually know what they can do. You've given them a 16-point list of, demand side and supply side solutions, but at the end of the day, the political calculus that continues to dominate the thinking is an unwillingness to be seen to do anything that may impact on house price or asset values. Moving on to the solutions, I really liked the neat Australia Institute solution of reducing demand through tax reform and redirecting that to build affordable supply, which then Emma characterised as actually the best form of rental protection, being a big bank of social housing, able to put downward pressure actually on the private rental sector as well. And then, of course, we had that important discussion about rental control and how that might look, ending with the position that it's not a silver bullet, but rent stabilisation can be an important part of the mix. And look, we could we also talked, of course, in a very important way about efficiency in the building and housing construction industry as well. And I think there's space for some further innovation and thinking there. And I guess it's no surprise that, 3 economic organisations tell us that we need to go back to and look again once more holistically at our taxation settings. And I do think that's important, and we can't, when we think about the intersections between tax and housing, we have to look at the taxation system in its entirety. Look, with that, and with so much more that could be said, we're actually going to have a short break now for 15 minutes, and we'll return at 3:30 for a session 12B, which will also look at additional recommendations for government action. Thank you all so much.